Please welcome to the stage Ian Dickinson, Vice President of Pre-Construction for Graham Infrastructure.
Thank you. In a slight departure from these pre-prepared remarks, I thought I'd mention that last year Graham sponsored the Lego recreation of one of our hospital P3 projects. And this year, given that probably our most major ongoing P3 project is the Regina bypass, we thought that might not render very well in Lego. So we thought we'd better switch it up and sponsor a different part of the conference. So we're delighted to be presenting sponsor for this session, which I think the conference program gave it an even more exciting title than the one on the slide. But as you all know at Graham, we love to build. We're constructors, and we're perhaps a little bit agnostic towards the contract model sometimes. We're really all about the building. However, we have been involved in more than a dozen P3 projects across Canada over the last decade. Most recently, our Regina Bypass project and the North Commuter Parkway project, which I think is picking up a gold award at lunchtime today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the moderator of this session, which is Sarah Clark. Sarah is the president and CEO of Fraser River Pile and Dredge, and she also brings a great deal of client-side experience to this panel and this stage. She was formerly the president and CEO of Partnerships BC and also worked for Bombardier Transportation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sarah and kick off the panel.
Thank you, Ian. So we've got a good, diverse panel today to cover our topic, which is largely focused on the challenges that contractors are facing in the construction of social infrastructure. I'm going to start with Tim Heavenor and introduce him. He has been Graham's Chief Financial Officer since December 2014, and he's concurrently Senior Vice President of Development and Strategic Investing, a role that has evolved from his initial hiring to launch Graham's infrastructure development business in 2007. Graham has led, and as we've heard, participated on a number of P3 projects, both on the social side and the infrastructure side. Beside him is Dave Jull, who has experience and a proven track record for the successful delivery of P3 projects since the late 80s, and has had varying infrastructure roles during these projects. These projects include the award-winning Fredericton-Moncton Highway, for which he was the project director, and the Lester B. Pearson International Airport Traffic Management Plan during construction, for which he was the project manager. Beside him, we have Doug Sanders, and many of you know Doug. He is a lawyer and a professional engineer with Borden, Ladner, Gervais, who practices in the areas of public-private partnerships and construction projects. Doug has experience in the preparation, negotiation, and review of contracts on leading P3s and construction projects on both sides of the table. He works often for the owner and often on the construction side. He was lead counsel for the Province of British Columbia Okanagan Correctional Center and the Surrey Pretrial Services Center, lead counsel to the design builder on the McLaughlin Point wastewater treatment plant, as well as many others. They're too numerous to name at this point, because I think, Doug, you were involved right in P3s from the beginning.
Pretty close. Not quite as much as Dave, though.
It sounds like most of actually our panel has been involved. So as I said, today we're focusing on the challenges of the contractors are facing in the construction of social infrastructure. The opinions on the panel will vary, but I think many of people in the audience will relate to the challenges that they're seeing, as well as you may be seeing in your own businesses. And we look forward to questions that the audience has. So if we go back to 2002, the goal of P3s for a number of government agencies were cost and schedule risk, design and construction innovation, and a longer period that was able to drive this innovation while still having that warranty for the infrastructure, and making sure that the operation and maintenance period was well funded. There had been a number of projects across Canada where the projects were built, but there was not enough money set aside for that proper operation and maintenance. And that's one of the things that drove BC, where I'm from. In most cases now, projects are awarded by low price, and except for a few in the healthcare system in BC and lately in Alberta, there are very few examples across the country where the project has been awarded to the constructor that did not have that low price. While the social infrastructure market in Ontario has been dominated by two players, the contractors participating in the West have been varied. The owner procurement teams are consistently changing. There's so many projects that are going now, which we can say is a testament to the P3 model. There are a lot of new participants on both sides. This can cause challenges with knowledge through the procurement as well as into the construction period. In several provinces, P3s may be being moved away from due to newly elected NDP governments, and that would be the case in Alberta and BC, where it appears that these governments are moving away from the longer O&M period. We've also seen that the public doesn't have a really good grasp of the value that a P3 can bring, and often they're showing the side where that variable and interest cost is seen as being too expensive, and why shouldn't these projects just be done traditionally? So it is a hard case to be made to the public if they're interested at all. Contractor losses in construction, as well as P3s, aren't often talked about. As constructors, we're very sensitive to talking to our competition about financial information, but there just appear to be a growing discussion amongst contractors that participate in these large projects. And we say large, they're getting larger all the time. If you look at the ones in Ontario, the Eglinton Crosstown, and now the planned GO Transit expansion are becoming, I think that one's valued at about $9 billion, the upcoming. This is a big risk that contractors are taking on. So there is discussion that suggests that contractors aren't necessarily making their margins on these projects and maybe even experiencing losses in a number of cases. I'm going to ask the panel if they want to add to that from what they're seeing in their daily experiences.
I can definitely add to that. I've noticed that amongst private companies, contractors, there's a great deal more willingness to discuss the fact that we may have lost money on some of the recent projects that we've performed. And contractors are now willing to talk more about that because we can't sustain losses over a long period of time. If you've been reading the financial press, you'll notice that a large European construction company that's publicly traded recently announced, after reporting losses on several large jobs, that they were going to withdraw from participating in large infrastructure projects in the United States. In Canada, that team that is performing the Eglinton Crosstown project went to court, which was reported in the Globe and Mail. You can read all about it, in order to get more time and money from the customer. Carillion, everybody has jumped on bad behavior amongst the senior management of Carillion, but that company was one of the largest players in the P3 market in the UK and accepted many of the risks that ultimately they were not able to fulfill, and they've met their demise. Astaldi has recently also sought protection from creditors after taking on tremendous amounts of risk. And even in Ontario, it's been reported that there's a contractor struggling to meet their obligations on several P3 projects, and you can read about some of the actions of their creditors in the Globe and Mail as well. So there's something going on. It's not sustainable for us to accept losses on projects over an extended period of time, and as the Chief Financial Officer at Graham, it worries me. We have delivered very good value. We have made money across a whole portfolio of projects, but recently we're struggling to get to, we're certainly struggling to get to our bid margin.
So our question to the panel today and to the audience, is this just the market at work, or are there some fundamentals in the way that we are procuring projects in Canada that make this unsustainable? And that's what we're going to explore. So we're going to start a roundtable, and I'm going to ask the panel right now, what are the major challenges facing contractors in the P3 market? I'll start with, since we've started with Tim, I'll go to Dave.
Well, I think, Tim, you already sort of put it on the table, but I would say risk transfer, and maybe more specifically, inappropriate risk transfer. I think at the inception, P3 started out to be a transfer of risk to the party best able to manage it, and a process was gone through to look at all the risks and identify who should carry it. And then on the contractor bidding side, they would price those risks and have a wrap-up number that dealt with it. What we're seeing more and more often is a wholesale shoveling of risk over to the bid team. Some of those risks are not manageable, and as Tim mentioned, you know, some contractors have suffered losses as a result, and indeed Carillion has failed as a result of some of those risks. It's not entirely that, but those risks that are not appropriate for them to take on have ended up causing some serious financial hardship for those companies. And I think we need to step back a little bit and look at a better approach to how we manage risk and who should handle it.
Doug, you both work on both sides. You're the creator of the risk transfer and the advisor on the risk transfer.
I think that's a touch unfair, but yeah, sir, I think part of what we're seeing is that we've, I think, gotten through a lot of the lower hanging fruit. I think a lot of the projects now are larger, they're more complex, and I think part of the challenge that the constructors face is that a lot of the projects, or some of the projects at least, are kind of less ready for market. I think one of the things that were the hallmark of the early P3 market in Canada was that the projects came well-defined, they were well thought through, the land was acquired, the permitting was done, they were shovel-ready pretty much. I think for political reasons, for other reasons, a lot of the projects that we see now are less ready. And I think that part of what's driving that is that some of the complexity is hard for them to get their minds around. And the contractors haven't been very successful at pushing back on some of the risk transfer that Dave talked about. And so these added risks, either late delivery of land or some of the more challenging permitting risks, are being thrown across the fence as if those can be managed as well by the private sector. And I think those are real challenges. So I think part of what I'm seeing anyway is projects that aren't nearly as street ready coming to the marketplace, and they're harder. They're not the low-hanging fruit that we saw in the early days.
So, Doug, when you work for the owner, my perception is that we've gone through a couple generations of these projects, and the owner has kept track of places where they end up with a change order or something that wasn't quite covered in the contract the way they wished it was. They ended up paying a few dollars more, and they don't want it to happen again. So they've loaded up the contract. So this contract is getting bigger and bigger and heavier every time, trying to eliminate the possibility that the contractor would ever have a change order come back to the owner, and or that the owner would ever face any additional costs. And the consequence of that is the owner is pushing at contractors risks that you cannot quantify or that you cannot know about. You're not going to really understand that risk till you're partway into the project. But the lawyer that's worked for the owner has written a contract that's going to button down the contractor so that there's no opportunity to claim. And the answer when we complain about those things in collaborative meetings with the owner is just price it. But we can't. Some of it is unquantifiable. It's difficult to know how to price it, and frustrating when some of our competitors eventually do, and end up with a contract.
But are we seeing a reduction in bidders across the country?
I think that's what you're seeing. I think the price it answer is, I can't, so I'm going to withdraw. They're just going to step out of the market. And we've seen people step out, step back in, because P3s aren't going away. And it's a legitimate procurement tool. So people look at it and then they reconsider and they step back in, they get burnt, they step out. I think those are just symptoms of this issue of having inappropriate risk or unquantifiable risk, and them looking at their bottom line saying, this isn't worth it.
I think there's some truth, Tim, to what you're talking about. I think part of the challenge is that the model was done using reasonably simpler projects, and so they were always reasonably heavy risk transfers, but the issues that you're now seeing pop up as being significant were always transferred to the contractor side, because there's a very small bucket of things where the owner retains risk. But now you're seeing those come to fruition. And having ignored them in the past because they weren't, you take Kicking Horse Canyon. Who cares about existing contaminants? You're in the middle of nowhere. Existing contaminants is not a big risk on Kicking Horse Canyon. But you transfer the same model and the same package to South Fraser or to Port Mann. It's a very different project. And if you don't rethink the risk profile, you wind up with some really significant problems.
So where do you think, what are some suggestions to improve the model as we see it today? What do you think that owners can be doing across the board to maintain the goals, the on time, the on budget, the long-term maintenance, reduce the public sector risk, but also maintain what they should have? Where do you see the market going? What do you think the owners could best do?
Well, the language that we use to describe these contracts are partnerships, but it feels at times like an effort to unload risk from one side to the other side. And in fact, there are some risks that you will encounter partway through the creation of your design, partway through the regulatory process that you're going to have to deal with, that was created by your customer ultimately. And it's so hard to be alone in dealing with those issues. So a suggestion that I would have in a very general way is for an owner that finds constructive ways to truly collaborate with their contractors, to help manage change, to mediate constructively through disputes. I've heard a lawyer that's currently on the stage recently say that every contract that's been written around a P3 contract could break the contractor if the owner really wanted to do that. And I worry about the intent of our customer if they're holding a piece of paper that has the opportunity in it to break us.
But I was misquoted quite a little bit. And the misquote was that every construction contract ever written, including P3s, if administered correctly or
Was that
incorrectly.
to make me feel better? That
Yeah,
clarification?
But I mean, I think, and I've said this for quite some time, I think one of the things that is missing to varying degrees in varying projects is a third P. I mean, a lot of these projects are, everybody spends a lot of time, energy, glasses are clinked when the 14 volumes of contract documents are done. The PBCs and the IOs of the world disappear. They leave you with the good or not so good graces of an owner who may or may not understand the contract. And depending on who you've got on the other side of the table, it could be go to your corners and come out fighting. And that third P is almost meaningless. And I think that's a real mistake, because I think that smart owners, and we've been counseling our owners for quite some time about this, recognize that it's got to be in the best interest of the project. And that doesn't always mean that I get a small W win. It means that overall the project gets a win. And if I've theoretically transferred a risk to the other side that I can assist with, if I'm in the owner's chair, why not? I think that you have to look at these things in their broader spectrum. One of the problems that we've seen in a number of projects is they get to the end, and both sides have this real desire to get to substantial completion. One side politically, the other side monetarily, but you may not have a really completed project at that point. And why is that? Well, it's because both parties haven't really done what they need to do to get to that stage. But I think that third P is crucial. I think that there's a real need to refocus on that. I think there's a real need during the collaboration stage at the beginning and during the procurement for real discussion about what those risks are. Like, even the lawyer in me, I really hate diving into 400 comments on a PA that's, it's its 15th hospital. Is IO really going to listen even if there's a really different issue? Probably not. But at some point, it is going to drive contractors out of the market because it's unaffordable. And we really do need to engage on those issues that matter on a project-specific basis.
So this is primarily looking at social infrastructure and but it does extend to all. Where are you seeing, Tim, you're the CFO. I'm sure when your project directors come in to talk about whether they're doing well and making their margins on a quarterly or monthly basis, where do you hear the most repeated challenges in the social infrastructure side, within the contract requirements?
Well, the phrase "fit for purpose." What we've struggled with is that the purpose that the owner has evolves through the life of the project and through the people that are on that project. In British Columbia, the contract that's in use there actually gives the opportunity to the owner to decide whether something is fit for purpose at the very end of the contract. By accepting or not accepting what you've built, you potentially are in a situation where you need to gut the building you've created because it wasn't fit for purpose as they define that at the end of the project. So that's extraordinary. So fit for purpose. In fact, I heard just at this conference an engineering firm say to us that their insurance company will not provide them with professional liability insurance if we sign them up for a contract that has the phrase fit for purpose built into it. So
that would be one area where the public sector lacks an understanding of how deep that risk can go and how vulnerable that can put a contractor. Yeah. And Dave?
Well, it's a good point. I mean, the insurers of these projects, often, I'll be blunt, insurance is a revenue stream bought and paid for by the project developer, and they want to access that money. And so, for us as design professionals, getting that insurance is increasingly difficult. And as Tim said, certain language, certain clauses in those contracts makes the insurer say, hell no, we're not in for this. And so the pool of people who will insure is smaller, and their ability to take the risk that we're asking, and the numbers are going up, not down. Mm-hmm. So that ability to get that kind of insurance is getting really, really difficult. And so, now we're in the point of, in my particular business, we're going to bet the company. Well, our board won't let me do that. And good news, good that they won't. But now you're going to have a struggle of, well, where do I find somebody who can design this thing for me? Mm-hmm. And if you can find somebody who will do it, but there's probably no assets, so when you sue them, you're not going to get anything. And is that really the answer that you want? I don't think so.
So Doug, you made the comment, just to build on Dave's, about projects being shovel-ready or more ready to go with more of the pre-work checked off, it being in a better state. Does this go with the design as well?
Absolutely. We spend, on the projects we act for project owners, we spend a lot of our time helping the design team get to some clarity in the project requirements, because the project requirements are everything. There should not be, to Tim's point, a heavy reliance on fit for purpose. That's a really lazy way of saying we'll get whatever we feel like. The project requirements should be really well defined. For my money, and this is perhaps a personal opinion, the whole review process, particularly in the hospital side, I don't understand how you can have a set of project requirements and then have doctors, nurses, and the other owner folks in there in the procurement during the design, trying to help figure out what the design should look like. That really needs to be nailed down before you go in. Whether it's P3s or any other type of construction project, the whole team should want the contractor to get in, get out, and never have to come back. And that is not enhanced by having a really poorly defined set of requirements, and a set of requirements that has this kind of overarching, if we didn't get it right in the first instance, we can fix it by saying it wasn't fit for purpose. I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
I'd just jump in here a little
Yeah.
bit. I completely agree with Doug on the whole, let's get it defined clearly so we can bid it. But I've seen, certainly on the transportation side, which is sort of my area, where there's been a real movement to, I'd say, highly prescriptive designs that don't give a bid team any flexibility. The whole idea of innovation, even a small I innovation, it's gone because there isn't that latitude. We're seeing, projects where they specify how many lines of girder should be in a bridge deck. I mean, really, so we're bidding really on how much does a cube of concrete cost, and that's not what P3s are supposed to be about. So getting to a clearly defined scope is important, but getting super prescriptive on what that looks like doesn't help get you competitive designs that meet your project requirements.
No, I think we'd all agree having the performance specifications, they're not easy to write. You have to work hard at them. You have to think about what you really want as the outcome, and you have to leave enough flexibility to be able to drive that innovation. If you look at the very successful projects, you've seen you've seen significant different approaches to the design that you say, okay, that's what makes a P3 work. It's not everybody just bidding the same stretch of highway or the same type of bridge or the same type of model to deliver that hospital.
But in part, the owner's project team has to be part of educating, especially a new owner. It's not an owner who's, this is their 15th project. But if you're doing a one-off or the first of a series of projects for a new owner, a lot of that is institutional change. Some of the projects we've been involved in, it took a long time for the owner to get the right team in place that bought into the process and didn't want to specify every nut, bolt, and screw in the project. And it's a really difficult institutional organizational change piece that isn't often understood. And especially if the delivery method's being foisted upon that particular agency or that entity, there's going to be real resistance within the folks who are actually involved in the project to the types of things that you're talking about.
So if you could change a few things in the model as we see it today, how would each one of you, what would you each like to see? What would be your top 2 changes you'd like to see? We'll start with Tim.
Yeah, so, the dynamic that we've just described, or the paradox maybe, is that we're trying to create a process that will be creative and offer innovation in the solution to the issues that the customer is seeking, but also a contract that we can price and have certainty around when we deliver it. So there's a paradox there. And I think in fact, if the owner is prepared to work with us in a more collaborative way, we can start this process out competing concepts amongst contractors, and an owner can choose one that they prefer. But if that was us, I would want an extension of the time from there till drawings that we're pricing, so that we can get to a greater degree of certainty about what it is that we're going to be delivering, what it is the owner has agreed to buy from us, so we're not faced with enormous risk when late in the process they say, it doesn't really do what I wanted it to do, and there's this fit for purpose clause there. And so I'm going to make you undo all of this, and we've got a hard price that we've bid against. So lengthening the collaborative process, or finding a way to have a contract that ultimately has more of the contract specifications that we've put into our submission, our drawings, would be something I would very much favor. I worry that in Canada, financing is kind of the tail wagging the dog. We rush to reach financial close within 90 days because we've got fixed price financing tied to a bid, but we've got 30% drawings tied to that same bid. And giving a fixed price on 30% drawings is an extraordinarily risky thing to do, especially with some of the language that's in that contract. I'm not sure that it isn't possible. I think it is possible to disconnect the way in which we are financing projects in Canada from that procurement process. I would prefer that the financing was left till later. It has become a commodity. In bids that we've done recently, I've been able to estimate what the price will be for our competitors relative to us because their covenants are reasonably well understood in the market. And we get it right, which means the owner can get that right, which means you don't necessarily have to have the financing competition happening at this stage that it currently happens at. If we could spend more time in the collaboration, you got 3 proposals, you've decided you like ours. Let's advance before we've tied ourselves into a contract, a hard bid contract. Let's advance those drawings from 30 to 80 or 90%. Let's define what's in those drawings in the contract. Let's sign against that. And if we become uncollaborative in that process, then throw us under the bus and pick the next team. I think the owners have enough sophistication that they could do that.
But that just really, does that go to Doug's point that the time isn't being spent up front to clearly define what they actually want, and it's a more of, I'll wait until I see it. So you're saying if you can't define it up front, then give me that longer period to show you what you need to see.
Yes.
Okay. Dave, do you want to add to that? What are you seeing?
Well, I guess I'm a little bit worried about this extended period because it seems like that's going to cost me more money as a designer at risk. And I already think we have a lot of money at risk when we're bidding in the first place. And one of, I'll say, the design industry's concerns is the cost of bidding keeps going up. So, you know, we got to win better than 1 in 3 and have a really nice margin on the ones we win to cover the bid costs on the ones we don't win. And if you look around, that's an extraordinary track record. I mean, that's just not hit every day. So when we say we'll do a 30%, then we'll work to an 80, my question is, so who's paying me? Because that's a big number. And if we can't get to a signed deal and I take my losses and go home, we won't do it, or we'll do it once and we won't do it again. It's really, really easy.
So if the owners aren't paying up front to spend all the time to do the definition, then they need to be looking at paying more through the procurement process. If there was a process that was like this.
Yeah, if you could have a 2-step process and somebody's going to pay us, we're happy to do it and we're happy to work collaboratively, but we're not going to bet the company on a win.
I think it's very hard on the government side. Even, you know, there are stipends, and I think the people that work in the procurement of these big projects understand the value of the stipends. It's very hard to convince their political masters that that money is well spent, where you see higher ones paid on the private side.
And people say, oh, they just collected the stipend, that's why they bid. Wrong.
Right.
Nobody ever made money on a stipend.
No.
You know, you can't have a compliant bid and make money on a stipend. I mean, that's just ridiculous.
And something else that's not necessarily well understood by the people that are running these procurements report too. Doug?
Only 2, eh?
We can have 3.
I mean, I think I'd like to start in a slightly different place, which is that I think, at least from my chair, we've had a lot of very successful projects in this country, and we've got a really strong track record. We've got a really strong set of procedures that I think, on the whole, are very good. I don't think we're talking, unless I'm missing something, about completely rewriting how this is going to work. I think we're more talking about some tweaks, perhaps significant tweaks. I think there are things on the procurement side that can be done better. I think to the point that was raised earlier, making it more available to contractors and the bid teams, frankly, to bring their innovative skills to the fore and actually create value. I think we are seeing too much in terms of narrow definition of project requirements. And part of that, unfortunately, driven by lawyers. I think we're very focused on what fairness means in the procurement process. And I have perhaps a broader view of that as long as each of the teams is given the same opportunity during the bid phase, that is fair. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're stuck bidding to the same set of documents, and I think there are ways of structuring that that would create a lot more innovation. But that's a bit of a hard pill for some folks to swallow. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff on the design and construction side, but I think probably the biggest one is that there needs to be a real focus on educating the folks who are taking over. The constant turnover of people on both sides of the fence. You know, when you're into your 10th project director and 15th folks, or 15th lead on the construction side, you've lost a lot of the knowledge of what's gone on. There's a lot of, in a lot of cases, there isn't transition from the procurement phase to the construction phase. I think there's a lot of knowledge transfer that isn't happening. And I think that especially as we move away from, the agencies that have done a lot of these projects into agencies that are doing their first or second or third project, they need a lot more support, and I don't see that happening. And so you're left with agencies who don't have a lot of experience, especially with the P3 model, struggling to figure out how to administer these. And so there's a great variance in what Tim and other contractors get on the other side of the fence when they show up to work.
So that all leads to a good question from the audience here. Are contractors gambling more than they should to win these bids? When you have the variable, who are they dealing with? You don't know necessarily, even if the team that you work with during procurement could change. You don't know what type of approach the person executing the contract will be. And I guess going back to your earlier point, Doug, around contracts can be used to, a very high degree against the other side. Are contractors gambling too much? And to Dave's point, are they going to see less and less teams bidding on these projects, or is there always going to be enough teams that the way it's being procured today will continue to go on? Because when I hear about projects, there's 5 lined up for the Patello. We haven't heard the short list for that. There was 7 to 9 people said for the Surrey LRT. Where are we seeing the reduction? Is it more on the social infrastructure side?
Well, I think in social, and it's not my area, but if you look at the Ontario market for social, there's really only 2 teams that ever bid or win. So maybe there's some other people throwing money at it, but there's only 2 that win. So can there be more? Probably there's room for some more, but the third qualified team generally is weak by a mile, at least in social in Ontario, but I don't think that's so much the case with the big transportation projects. There seems to be more people, more teams, and more ability to bid that.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to me how many bidders you find on these projects, and it always surprises me when someone shows up that's never been part of this market before, and they're going to show us how to do it. I'm impressed when they take on those risks. I don't think I've heard of many of them where that's worked out. We've seen many come and go in this country. I guess coming to the question of how much we're risking when we bid these projects.
And combine that with your comment on certainty.
Yeah.
What is your definition as a contractor of certainty? Everyone has a variable amount. There's no certainty in contracting, regardless of the model.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that's happening in Canada is that we're putting 3 sets of drawings together. We're spending money, quite a bit of money, coming up with 3 designs, or 4, I guess, in some cases. And that's very expensive to do it. And it's very expensive to take the risk in signing up for a contract where you only have 30% drawings. And I'll throw out a really radical idea, and that is I like the idea of the government paying a larger stipend, but frankly, that has its challenges as well, because you have so many resources tied up. Even if you got 80% cost recovery from all those resources, it can take hundreds of people to put one of these bids together. And if you're making nothing or getting a portion of your cost back, it's not very attractive compared to other opportunities that are available in the marketplace. So here's the radical idea. Select a team on the basis of their qualifications and their approach to a project. Interview them extremely well and go with one. Just pay for one design and find a way to off-ramp if those guys get crazy or try to take advantage of that situation in an unfair manner. I know that public sector clients in Canada in particular worry about those kinds of procurement models, but early contractor involvement is very common in the private sector. We've seen IPD, which is now getting used in Ontario. Essentially, that's how you're getting selected for an IPD project. There's things called progressive design and build, where there's less certainty for the owner at the beginning of the process. They've selected a team on the basis of their qualifications. If there's no corruption involved in that process, as a competitor, if our competitor is picked because they have better qualifications and a better approach to a project, I can accept that. I would rather, frankly, be grumpy about not having that than having spent millions of dollars on a bid that either, canceled or that we lost, or even worse, we won it and found out that the contract we signed was going to cost us tens of millions of dollars. So I'm in favor of selecting contractors on the basis of their qualifications and a rigorous assessment of their approach to that project. That's controversial.
Yeah, what would you say to your public sector clients on that one, Doug? They're looking for cost certainty. They're looking for schedule certainty. How do they know through a qualification process that team will bring the innovation and the drive to the best cost solution and best technical solution combined if they've only chosen one?
So I echo Tim's view that in the private sector, we see a lot of those things. We'll have, if anyone wants to chat about IPD over beers, I'm happy to do that. But leaving aside that, early contractor involvement, we've done that with our private sector clients for a decade, choosing on the basis of qualifications or a rough price. We've done that for a long time, locking in fees, locking in general conditions. Like those are reasonably tried and true and frankly almost the norm now amongst a lot of the developer clients that I work for on the private sector side. I think it is more difficult, and the primary area where it's difficult is from an auditing perspective. A lot of the public sector clients have to be auditable. You can gain that through, as long as the contractor isn't doing a lot of own forces work, you can probably gain that through third-party pricing in any event. But the real challenge that you point out is schedule. So if you get a year and a half in, and you can't get to nirvana with that one contractor, I think it would be really challenging then to try to go to another contractor at that point. And so your project lives or dies in the success of that one relationship, which if it works is terrific. If it doesn't work is really challenging. And to your point earlier, Sarah, while we've seen a number of bidders at the RFQ stage, there are a number of projects where we've seen either pricing that was clearly not real or bidders not showing up with their final prices because they weren't satisfied with the risk profile or with the answers that they got during collaboratives. So I'm not sure that we're getting as much competition as we could simply because of the way things have been structured. So I think there are some things that we can take away from the private sector. The private sector's been learning from the P3 market. And I think somewhere in the middle is probably the right answer.
So I have a question about that. That leads into, there are mechanisms for the public sector entities that are procuring to have the input from the contractors. It starts at the business case stage where the market sounding is done. And then a process has been built into the Canadian approach to P3s, which is there are numerous collaborative sessions. So why are these engagement not working? Because I'm sure they're here, I'm sure that you, Tim, your company is voicing in the early market soundings and things you would like to see changed in risk transfer. And then you move into the collaborative and you're looking at the documents in front of you. What are you seeing? Are you seeing that there's not a lot of change during that time, or you see the
No,
client?
it's mixed. You know, I think if the procurement team on the public sector side is able to understand and absorb the issues that the contractor is raising with them, and if they're willing to collaborate in the solving of those issues, I think creative solutions can be found. And I'm confident that we've delivered very good value in a number of the P3 projects that we've delivered, and the owner has been quite content with the way that evolved. But it almost always evolves. There's something that the owner hadn't fully absorbed or understood or recognized that you probably couldn't have entirely known about at the very beginning of that process. One of the areas that is like that is in relation to regulatory matters. Because the owner will often say, I can't get a permit on this until we know what design
Good point,
the contracting team is going to present. But the complexity of the regulatory system that we've created in Canada, which incidentally is chasing capital out of this country, it's so complex that to have thought of all the issues that could arise in a contract early in that process is virtually impossible. So there needs to be some give and take and some understanding that, you know, on the owner side, you're trying to get something done. We will work with you and even take a leadership role in getting regulatory approval, but things can happen in that process that neither of us could have foreseen. And we need to be collaborating with each other to work together to solve those problems. And you can't put all of the cost of that on us, or we're just going to blow up.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, if you think of the regulatory regime, we've certainly seen that there are problems almost always centered around environmental issues of one kind or another, because most of the other things, utility relocations, while utility companies can be a bit prickly to deal with, you kind of know what you have to do, and you'll eventually get the piece of paper you need. But with environmental agencies, that's not the case. It's not so clear. My expert and your expert can see the same problem entirely differently, and both have legitimate arguments. How do you resolve that? When you're the owner, you get to say, well, I'm the owner.
Right.
That's not so good from our side of the table. So, you know, maybe some kind of an approach to a shared risk. We've seen that on some of the earlier P3s where risks were known, recognized by both sides, but not really very quantifiable. So they said, sort of up to some threshold limit, it's yours, Mr. Bidder. After that, we have a risk-sharing program that deals with it beyond that. So maybe those kind of approaches, which we don't see so much now, maybe they need to be reintroduced, you know, so we have a better understanding of what the risks are and how are we going to mitigate them when that thing that we can't foresee happens.
You raise a very good point. The regulatory process is ever evolving, I think, with every project, and I don't think owners can anticipate the requirements, let alone the contractors that are coming out of the agencies, because it's very much being created as we go along now.
Yeah, and I mean, depending on which public sector client you're dealing with, First Nations may be an issue that, again, is uncertain, and engagement with not only First Nation stakeholders, but other third-party stakeholders is pretty challenging. Your question started with market soundings, and I guess my experience with those is that they have to be taken with a grain of salt, because the bidders are coming in with a desire for that project to proceed, and whether or not you're going to get fulsome responses on a particular methodology that's being used in that project or a particular risk. But, you know, one of the, again, I think one of the other issues, as you said, the collaborative process, I think focusing on more of a term sheet approach where we take the top 20 issues. We know that utility relocates are always an issue, or land access, or whatever the top 20 are for that particular project, and not diving into the indemnity provisions of the PA, focusing on how those are being shared or not, and having fulsome discussions about those at a very early stage in the collaborative process, I think would be more helpful than issuing an RFP and draft PA that, especially the lawyers like to dive in and give you 400 comments on. So I think rejigging that process to really talk about what's important, I think would be useful.
Well, that sounds very productive. There's been a few, just before I go into the final question for our panel, there has been a number of questions about labor from the audience, so we'll recognize the concern in the audience, and it's not just about labor to complete P3 projects, skilled labor, but I think it's about every resource required. With the number of projects in infrastructure going in across Canada, I know, Tim, you're concerned about foreign investment, but I think there's almost there is a huge wave, whether it be in BC or Ontario or in between, of infrastructure, whether it be P3 or not. So how are your firms managing the approach, and how will the owners be able to also have the amount of people they need to be able to be effectively administering these procurements and contracting? Is this a concern for you right now?
Yeah, actually, that question could be turned back at you, as I know, because you're facing a government that's got some ideas about labor in British Columbia.
It's not what today is about.
Availability of well-qualified labor is constantly an issue, and I don't think that issue will ever go away. I will point out, actually, though, that we make the most money when we're the least productive. What I mean by that is not that we want to be unproductive, it's just when there's really strong demand in the marketplace and an imbalance in favor of the contractor, you can charge more for the labor. You're putting people to work, but they're less qualified people that you're putting to work, and they're going to be less productive. And when you get into that situation, if the market will allow you to charge for it, you might do okay. In Western Canada, at the moment, that's not the situation. British Columbia is an exception, but on the prairies, there's an imbalance the other direction. Owners are getting extraordinarily good value because the oil and gas sector is in recession. But getting great qualified labor is a long-term systemic problem around all of North America. People haven't chosen skilled trades as a career like they used to. The 1980s devastated people so much that very few people went into the construction industry, into skilled labor in that period of time, and we're really missing a generation of leadership and what's coming up behind. Have so many other choices other than construction that we are all fundamentally challenged. And technology is going to be part of the solution there. We've been, as an industry, we've been advancing technology for many years, for decades, to try and remove some of the skill required in certain tasks related to construction, but we haven't got past a fundamental shortage in labor that's always going to be an issue.
And how about in your business, Dave?
Well, I think the story is the same. I mean, we have a national business, so we're busy certainly in Ontario, but our Western Canada business and our Quebec businesses are also very busy. There's a lot of infrastructure work just generally going on. So we try to move work around to where people are less busy. But lately we've had mostly people saying, well, don't send it here because we're not less busy. Right. So there is a finite ability to respond. We're a global company, so we can go to our partners in the U.S. or Europe, but we have to deal with currency exchange rates and all that good stuff, and even foreign workers and licensing and all that good stuff, which makes it difficult to move a bridge design to the UK and still have it acceptable here. So it's an option, but it's not without its challenges. I think the other thing is, irrespective of how many foreign entrants there are to the market, when it comes to putting a shovel in the ground, it's the same subtrade that's going to dig the hole. You might have a different management team, but the people who actually will build it are the same people. So they're limited in that respect. So you can have more money, you can have more guys telling you how to do it, but the same person going to dig the hole.
And that's Tim's point.
Yeah.
We have a deficit. So just listening to the panel and the questions today, am I hearing that it sounds like the P3 market needs to do a broader review of where we've come? We're 20 years or more in, depending on when you say that it all started and the early projects, but in the bigger wave, say 15 years, is there a broader review required of what the goals of the owners are versus the sustainability of the contractors being able to deliver that? Is that what we're talking about? And if we are, how would that be done? What would you suggest to the agencies out there and the owners that are planning large projects? If you could give them advice.
You know, I was a big fan of Partnerships BC, particularly, Sarah, when you were running it. And
If you believe that, we'll talk later. Yeah.
I think there was some great work done amongst agencies in Canada to learn the lessons from managing procurement and to find a way to be the third P in partnership. But my feeling today is actually that that's disintegrating. And the number of people that have chosen to stay in the procurement side for the public sector as a long-term career is gone down. So you've got a lot of really new people coming into very senior roles with very little experience behind them. And so the ability of the public sector to manage procurement seems to be diminishing. And I don't have a solution for that problem. I did like an opportunity to have an open dialogue over a portfolio of projects with a public procurement agency. But if that process ultimately leads to a one-sided approach to we're going to figure out all the risks that we can flow on you and just dump them on you in a contract, then it's not going to work out either. And so what we will do is pick the things to participate in that we can handle. And frankly, while the owners go through a process of assessing contractor teams, we've introduced the process of assessing the owner team to understand whether we truly can build a collaborative relationship with the owner. And if we can make that work, we can do great things together, and we can deliver great value. We think we can do our part, and we're really pleased when we find owners to work with that do their part. But that's going to be fragmented.
That goes into Dave's comment about you'll see less bidders, or you may see them, you're saying you might see bidders concentrated to say, depending on who they see on the other side and how much listening or how much experience they may be having done.
Yeah.
Dave, what do you see? What's your advice for owners?
Well, I think one of the things I didn't say when we were talking about that labor pool is, my observation is that there's a finite labor pool to build, there's a finite pool of talent that can design it, but equally, there's a finite pool on the owner side to run these programs, and that's tapped out because there's so much in the market, and we're seeing it. I think we're seeing it in terms of Doug's comment about the rollover of senior staff and all of that kind of stuff. So we're getting inexperienced people running these projects that don't necessarily have that long-term view of how this process has evolved over the last 15 or 20 years.
Right.
They don't bring that to the table, and that's partly how you lose the third P. Maybe not that deep in understanding of how collaboration can work effectively without having to give away the farm. So I think that is an important aspect of the whole, how big is the labor pool? It's not just on the bid side, it's on the owner side as well.
Exactly. Doug?
Yeah, I think the word leadership, one of the things we've also lost is some of the political leadership in a number of the provinces in terms of driving appropriate decision-making. And leadership within organizations is challenged both by political desires and by the fact that we're dealing with much more complex, really significant projects, which are a lot harder to do than the early ones that we were working on. And so that leadership is challenged in a variety of ways. I think there is primarily at the organizational level a challenge getting the right people on both sides of the fence. Owners are very fussed about the fact that there's bait and switch. The best people are in the 4 proposals, and they can't be on 4 projects if you happen to win all 4 of them. So I think that when you drill down, this is, as every industry, it's about people. And we do have an issue around the folks that are coming up and the folks that are in the stream right now.
Yeah, thank you. Our time is up, so I thank all the panelists for their viewpoints. The P3 market has matured to the point where we're having very good discussions around the challenges. How do we sustain it? How do we still get those value for the owners, as well as making it a market that all the contractors can productively participate in? Appreciate the comments from the audience today as well, and we'll say goodbye. Thank you.